for the rostering in my work, the roster is given like 2 weeks time, within 2 weeks time. Like, for example, right now they will give a schedule that is good for 2 weeks. However, I, as much as I want to give you the 2 weeks time schedule, I
Mhm.
cannot, because sometimes it changes.
Sure.
So yeah, there's no really permanent. So for us to work together, uh I can give you like weekly time, just to make sure that everything's going well and according to plan.
That's perfectly okay. So what we'll
Yeah.
do is we'll start off with one unit today, which is going to go parallelly with some of the times that we will have in terms of availability at your end. And today's session, what I'm going to do is obviously start you off with the management of human resources unit. This session
Okay.
we are going to record. This will also go across on our YouTube channel, so you should be able to watch it later if you have any doubts and queries. But I will discuss today learning outcome one, and also we'll cover learning outcome one, and we'll also cover the background about the unit, and what is the importance of studying this as far as the subject is concerned.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's all
So,
good.
and if you have any questions in the meanwhile, you can ask me through the chat route, or you can ask me there and then. And what I'll do is I'll respond to some of the questions. So we are going to cover this today with the help of a presentation, a video, a couple of other things that I've got, and we'll take on this particular session. And then for tomorrow, I'm actually busy up till 3 o'clock. So the session will either happen, early morning, say UK 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock time, or it'll happen towards the time later in the afternoon, which is after 3 or 3:30. So we'll come to that in a spirit, but let's start off this session. And I'm going to share, you're able to see my screen in any case. So let me press record, and then we'll take it from there.
Oh, okay. Just one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask? Yeah. Regarding this one, I can't seem to see this one on my portal. I cannot access
You're going to see
other
everything, yes.
subjects.
So this unit is going to be fully
Okay, okay.
available. Yeah, this unit
Yeah.
is going to be fully available in terms of all the presentations, everything, books, handouts, everything will be available by close of play today. So whatever I'm going to show
Okay.
you, I'm just going to covering learning outcome one right now, but the new presentations, everything has been refreshed, and you'll be able to see that
Oh,
on your
okay.
portal by close of play today. So IT is
Okay.
working on it, and they have to just finalize the presentations, which are being quality checked. And then once they are there, this unit will be available beforehand. That's how it will be. You'll have all the units in the next 2-3 days across your course available, whether you study with us or
Okay.
you study, essentially on a self-study basis. But all the material is going to be available within this week itself. It's just being refreshed. As I mentioned to you, what
Oh,
DHM
okay.
has done is they've kept the contents of the unit pretty much the same, 50, 60, 70% of it, but the names of the units have
Yeah.
changed and some bits have been brought in new. So we are also refreshing as we go along, but they should be all completed within this week.
Okay. Noted on this.
Now,
Thank you, Raman.
no worries. Let's start with this particular unit, which is, HRM. Now, there are lots of reasons why we study, human resources management. Now, human resources management is a very wide and a vast field, simply because this is a area wherein, we look at managing humans as a resource. That means there are lots of different types of resources. You look at financial resources, administrative, infrastructural resources, but one of the key resources which is able to control financial resources, one of the key resource that you see which can control and monitor and review everything is humans or people. So people management or human resource management is basically related to managing employees, recognizing their needs, and to be able to maintain and provide for their needs so that they can then work for you and get the goals and objectives achieved. At the end of the day, what you need to look at is, when we look at humans or when we look at people or when we look at staff, employees, whichever way you call it, there is a need for us to be able to manage the resource, to be able to give them a meaning and a meaningful direction in terms of for them to be able to achieve a job or a task or an objective. Now, when we see why do we see human resources becoming important in the 19th century and in the 20th century is because after World War II, when we see there was nothing left, everything, all nations were involved in rebuilding, and it led to the industrialization. So when you look at the last of 18th century, which is 1875, 1890 onwards, you see industrialization happening. A lot of people started to work in factories, in production or engineering places. Before that, most of the employability options, predominantly agriculture was the mainstay. And that is where what we see is this particular change, which has started to happen after industrialization, then World War I, World War II, and we see the rebuilding of nations happening, which is where a lot of people started to work in factories to be able to earn a living. And that is where the need for managing human resources actually came about. So this field, if somebody is to ask you this question, why do we need to manage human resources? One of the first things that you should be able to say is that we need to be able to manage human resources because they are required for us to recognize their needs and wants and to be able to emphasize what is required as an output. And that is what they are going to be able to fulfill. So you need to manage them. Now, when this study came about, in the 19th century, predominantly because human resources as a field began to take shape in the 19th century. And that is where we see the beginnings of HRM, or human resources management or human resources development. Two different terms, HRM and HRD, started to come about. Now, the main aspect of, when we talk about HRM and what HRM does, there are loads of things in which I can define how HRM works. So one of the functions that you normally see which HR does is recruitment. They will do recruitment and selection. The other function which you could look at, which HR does, is they will look at creating job descriptions, job adverts. They could be looking at after rewards and benefit. They could also look at performance appraisals. They could be looking at introducing schemes or objectives which are predominantly going to be motivational schemes like bonuses, holiday trips, holidays, and some of the other awards that you normally get to see within the organization. And then they are also related to managing, complying, and laying down the rules for compliance related matters. So when we talk about employment law, when we talk about things which people have to adhere to and manage within a place of work, that is where you will see they will also be looking at dealing with labor laws, unions, anything which is related to the health and safety welfare of employees. Now, this part of the function, which basically is managing the employees, maintaining the employee welfare, ensuring that they have all the embodiments and resources available to be able to work effectively or function well within the organization or within their place of work, is going to be the whole aspect of what is called the human resources, management or human resources function. Now, there are lots of reasons why you would be asked to study, for example, human resource management. Now, one of the reasons that this unit has been asked to be studied in the course is that you will at some stage work as a part of a team. That means you would be one of the employees or one of the staff members who would be working along with others in an organization or at your place of work. So here, the main objective of looking at HRM is that you should be able to understand how to work with other colleagues. You should be able to understand working within teams, and you should also be able to understand how and what are the basic minimum requirements for you to be able to understand and work within an organization. So in this aspect, you are going to be looking at understanding HRM. The second reason that when we talk about, why do we need to study HRM in particular? Now, one of the reasons why you would also look at studying HRM is that if you were to look at wherein the HR managers or step into an HR manager's role, then you should have a good understanding of what and how you would develop resources, which is employees. How would you train them? How would you look after their needs and wants? And how would you ensure that they understand that these are the key objectives for the organization that they need to help come in and achieve? That means in their day-to-day responsibilities. So as a person, you would be required to understand how to maintain, how to design, how to process, and how to execute some of the company policies, strategies that are required for the company or the organization to function. Now, the main idea of HRM, one of the main ideas, there are lots of main, but one of the main ideas or focus of HRM would also be to look at how does the human resources side of things support the growth of a business? How do you help in managing the business effectively? How do leaders, managers, who or founders who have essentially started a business, how do they manage and micromanage some of their employees within the organization? And that will all happen through the function of HR, because you'll be responsible for creating job descriptions. Each of the job description will cover the role in detail. They will then be understood and formally announced to the employees who work within those roles. They will be given a bit of a remit in terms of how they work, where they work, when their work starts, and when their work finishes, what output they produce, what part of their output actually becomes an input for some of the other departments. All that is going to be programmatically covered in what is called human resources process or HRM process. And last but not the least, you are also looking at understanding what are the key contributions you are required to make. You are required to make essentially from a point of view of, sorry, you are required to make essentially from a point of view of, contributing towards the responsibilities that you will execute, and that will thereby help the organization achieve, their goals and objectives. So sometimes it's going to be looking at multiple reasons, to understand why this is to be done, or the background behind why you're required to do this in the organization. Now, if I were to summarize and say that, studying of this particular unit is important because it teaches you how to do management of human resources, how to manage the process. It also helps you understand how to motivate your employees, to keep your workforce, to retain the talent. And then last but not the least, also look at meeting regulatory requirements, legal requirements, complying with laws. One of the key things would be that if you were to work as an HR manager within the tourism and hospitality sector, you would need to be aware of what is the minimum wage which is supposed to be paid to the employees. What is the number of work hours employees can do? For example, if pilots are flying the airlines, they are not allowed to do a shift which is longer than 10 hours or 12 hours of flying, because this could affect their ability to be able to make decisions. Now, if these are compliances and laws which have been introduced, then as an HR department or as a person working within the HR having that responsibility, you would be required to understand some of this legislation and then put that to use accordingly. And when we look at studying this particular unit, we are going to study it in the context of travel and tourism. Human resources management is a vast field. It's a very vast field. And you would study this unit at level 4, level 5. You would study this even at master's level. And the only difference that would make at the master's level would be that I would add the word strategic before the human resources management. And the reason why I would add the word strategic is because when we talk about long-term planning, or when we talk about things that are going to be looked at from a viewpoint of a number of years, then at that stage you'll be looking at strategic objectives of how the HR would help the organization achieve, say, growth in different countries, or increase revenue or turnover to a certain aspect, or look at creating a customer delight wherein the customer experience index is the highest, or you end up getting this much market share. And that would all involve resource planning, which will be human resource planning, and that would become a strategic function, and that is why it will be called strategic HR. Now, this particular unit at your level, at level 5, we have 4 learning outcomes of this. It's been divided into 4 learning outcomes. So we'll start with understanding what is the objective of HRM, then go into some of the functions of HRM, then talk about how can internal and external factors affect the working of people within the company, or HR essentially. And then last but not the least, understand what role does HR play as against some of the other departments within the organization, like marketing, sales, finance, administration, manufacturing, production, depending on the organization, financial services. It could be depending on the sector that you are in. how does the HR contribute to the overall functioning of the organization. And that is what we are going to be looking at in learning outcome 4. But today we are going to start off with learning outcome 1, and for which we are going to go through some of the key contents of it by looking at a presentation. And that presentation will consist of a couple of slides, and we are going to discuss that as we go along, covering all the assessment criteria 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. So when we look at learning outcome 1, we are looking at knowing the purpose and objectives of human resources management. The unit aim I've explained to you already, and I've given you a bit of an introduction on this. And this is the bit of indicative content that we are going to be looking at covering in the unit. And this slide that you see on your screen actually summarizes the whole process, purpose, and objective of human resources management. In a nutshell, if you were to look at documenting or explaining what does HR do, what is their function, what is the purpose of human resources management in an organization or in a business, what does the department consist of in HRM, this slide would help you answer everything. So if you look at the HR cycle in particular, when we talk about the HR cycle, and when we look at the HR cycle, what we mean by that is that what are the key set of activities which HR does, when we look at their functions or roles and responsibilities, that they carry out in a business, and that can be described, beautifully by this particular, diagram. There are lots of ways that you can look at it, but generally speaking, this one that I looked at, does pretty much good justice to explaining and covering all the functions which HR would perform within a company. So they will start with things like, if you talk about how does human resources come into the organization, so start by putting your thinking hand on and say, we think of recruitment. Recruitment can be internal, external. Sometimes you see companies advertise vacancies internally on job boards, intranet of the organization, to give other employees from different departments to look at job rotation or change of a function, and that would mean internal. External would be when you advertise it on job boards, put out advertisements, get in touch with consultants or organizations which will help you recruit. Recruitment is then followed by selection. You get lots of CVs, you get lots of mail coming through with candidates interested. Then at some stage, what you're going to do is basically look at making a shortlist, and that will involve the process of selection, interviews, pre-screening, tests. Sometimes some organizations also ask employees to do some sort of aptitude test, like if you were joining as a programmer in Facebook or LinkedIn and you've applied for a programming vacancy with Python or Cocoa or Java, then the HR would be in their rights to be able to ask you to come in and do a test, which would primarily be asking you to do a bit of coding to see if you have the requisites required and experience required to be able to join as a coder or as a programmer. So depending on the job, you're going to be looking at the job description. The job description will lead to some sort of a process of selection. That would, once done, and the offer issued at some point in time, you'll get inducted into the organization, you'll become an employee, you'll get a handbook, you'll be under probation, you'll be given trainings. Once the trainings are done, you start performing your role independently, or as we say, you start flying solo, and then you start to do your job on a day in, day out basis. Now, with the job that you would be given, you'll be assigned a job description. The job description will detail out all the responsibilities and things that are expected of you in that role, what you need to be able to achieve. And in some cases, you would see job descriptions will also have things like rewards, your remuneration, your compensation or benefits, as we call it. And that would be a key part which the HR will maintain. Now, you might join a job in a company at a certain level. But when I say certain level, you are at grade 1, you're a sales executive. At grade 2, you're a senior sales executive. So there might be some sort of a titling and a grading happening within the company. Now, at each grade, there will be a pay grade. At each level, there will be some sort of difference in terms of benefits, pay, the benefits and the compensation that you get. And that would be something which the HR would provide in terms of a hierarchy. So when you have performed in a role for a couple of years, as an example, 3 years, you have performed exceedingly well, you're due for a promotion. Promotion would give you a raise in your wage or your salary. It'll give you a raise in your title and responsibilities. And that would generally be seen as a positive sign that the employee is doing well within the organization. Assessing of performance or performance appraisals are done at the end of the year. And that is something that you will see also being a function performed by HR. Now, when we talk about compensation, benefits, rewards, and schemes, that is where HR looks at motivating employees by introducing benefits or packages which will be, let's say, pushing the employees to achieve a bit more, to achieve the targets, to hit the targets. And that would be some part of that would be compensation which comes along with your package or your job. And some part of that would be called rewards and incentives. Say, for example, reward for the best customer experience executive, or reward for being the #1 sales performer of the year, or reward for being punctual on time, or working award for people who have worked in the organization for 3 years, 5 years. Sometimes you see employees get a watch, they get a voucher for lunch, things like that, to a 5-star hotel. And they would be ways through which HR is trying to motivate employees and keep them within the organization. There are compensation cycles, there are benefits which they look at, and compliance with laws. Assuming the company decides to post you from Australia to, say, UK, they will need to look at what are the various laws that are required for you as an employee to be able to move from one geography to the other. Does it require a visa, a work permit? What kind of salary and benefits would you get in a different geography when you're staying there? All will fall under the remit of compliance and labor laws, which they will also be required to look into. This would essentially help summarize, let's say, the role of HR. Now, I've got a very short video which I want to play also, just to give you a bit of a perspective in terms of what do we mean when we talk about HR as well. So let me switch you over and let's look at watching this particular video to get a bit of a quick overview and a perspective of what is human resource management.
Systems designed to manage people in an organization.
So let's start with
Human
this.
resource management are the formal systems designed to manage people in an organization. Human resource management is like a pinwheel. The management of people in an organization is at the center of 8 functional areas of human resource work. Human resource strategy and planning identifies and manages current and future needs to achieve organizational goals. Compliance is doing what is asked or required by federal, state, and local government in the management of people. Talent management are the integrated practices to attract, motivate, and retain productive and engaged employees. Training and development is about the betterment of people and performance through information they use. Performance management is the process that we use to ensure the organization connects mission with the work of employees. Total rewards are the financial and non-financial tools used to attract, motivate, and retain employees. Safety and health is about ensuring the safety, health, and welfare and security of the people at work. Employee and labor relations focuses on the relationship of employees with the organization and with each other. This human resource model should give you the context to understand and apply the important role of human resource management in today's organizations.
So as you can see with this small video, it gives you a very good idea in terms of what are the various functions which HR does or can be required to do within the organization. And this is what is going to be something that we are going to look at in a bit more detail when we talk about the whole aspect of management of human resources. So in general, when we look at going further on this particular discussion, we are going to be looking at covering a couple of aspects and a couple of definitions which are important for us to understand the whole aspect of this particular subject and its field of study. So let's look at one such key terminology. If I have to ask you to say, could you define what is human resources management? So here in this case, you can essentially say that it's a strategic and a coherent study to be able to effectively organize people within an organization. And why do you want to organize them? Why do you want to get them into an order? Is because you want them to achieve a certain objective for the company. At the end of the day, if you are working within an organization, your expectation would be that I would get paid at the end of the month because I'm rendering my services. And the organization's expectation would be that, you know, the employee would be performing some parts of the job quite well. And that would mean that at some stage, you know, we would need to make sure that the person is able to, you know, do that function. And that would be the role of HRM, to manage it as a conduit between the employer and the employee, and to ensure things are available from employer and to the employee for them to be able to work, and then vice versa from the employer, from the employee to the employer, that you are able to deliver on services or responsibilities which have been, you know, defined as per your experience or as per your, you know, qualification and experience on your CV. Now, when we talk about the concept of HRM is one thing, which is the field of study that we're going to look at. But when we talk about the concept of HRM, what we want to clearly know in this case is that we are looking at this as a function within the other functions within the organization. And when I say other functions, what I mean by that is you have marketing. Their role is to look at doing advertising, sales, promotions. When you look at sales, their goal is to sell products and services to consumer. When you look at finance, their role is to manage finances for the company, purchase orders, invoices, settlement of these invoices, management of credit limit with the banks, overdrafts, things like that, payment of, you know, one of the other functions in HR would be, in big companies, you see payroll and HR. The department is called HR and payroll. So HR also is responsible for, you know, let's say compiling and, you know, doing the pay wages or payroll at the end of the month. And one of the functions that will be responsible for, you know, ensuring that all employees are paid on time is that they will need to ensure that all the details of the employees are updated with them, and they are able to, as per their contract, process their wages. So the concept of HRM and the role of HRM is, concept would be more towards planning side of things, that this is how it needs to be looked at, this is how it needs to be done, and some part of it would be planned before even this action or any sort of an action is taken. Now, just a case in point, concept of HRM, if one of the suggestions in the yearly meetings or appraisals come across is that employees want some sort of a performance bonus, and if this is a recurring demand which is coming from all employees in their performance appraisal, then the HR department would be required to think that why is all employees are asking for some sort of a performance bonus. So this will start the process of thinking. At some stage, the HR manager and his team will actually come up with a proposal, take it to the director or the top management of the company. And with that proposal, when they take it, they are going to be able to discuss that what are the reasons why this has been done? What are the reasons why, or why do you think the employees are asking for it? And this is what we can do in the remit to change and make sure that they are motivated enough to stay within the company. And as a proposal, it will be put forward to management. The management will then decide. But this concept of performance bonus would be a part of planning, which HR would be able to put in the subsequent year, not in the previous year, but in the subsequent year. And that is where the concept will come. And that would mean that at some stage, all these ideas, feedback, appraisals which happen actually create a process through which they can be fed back into the system. And when I say system, I mean the employer. And then the employer looks at bringing out these new schemes or variations in contract or the conditions which allow the employees to work much more favorably and remain much more loyal and motivated to the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
None.
All right. Now,
Yep.
with this bit of understanding, what we are going to do is go into some of the assessment criteria. Now, one of the first assessment criteria it says is, can you explain how has human resources management evolved? Now, I have done a table, but I've also done a bit of a bullet point to explain how this concept of HR as a field, as a subject of study has actually come up. Now, as I mentioned to you earlier in the introduction or the start of the introduction, is that human resources management as a process, has seized its beginning in the early 19th century, which is where industrialization, modernization started to happen. And when we look at that, what we do see is that the concept of people working in large numbers within factories maybe initiated this concept of what we see in terms of the modern day subject in terms of HRM. Now, if we had to do a timeline and explain that how it has evolved over the decades, over the years, then this is the best way of doing it by doing it as a table. So you look at pre-World War II, wherein the focus primarily was on welfare. And when we look at employee welfare, it was welfare in terms of safety and health and well-being. Because in those days, if you look at when people were working in factories, accidents could happen, people could lose a limb or an arm or lose their life. And main focus of HR at that point in time was to ensure that the facilities provided where the workers are working are clean, safe, hygienic, and they are allowing for the employees to work favorably within the factories. That means it's well lit, they are not noisy, it is pollution free or smoke free, and it does not lead to any sort of accidents or emergencies wherein people could be threatened in terms of their life. Because if that was the case, then you would generally see people will not want to work in those conditions. In the 1940s and 60s, after World War II, we see industrial relations coming up quite heavily, in the sense that here the focus moved from just managing welfare of the employees to also managing the relations with employees. And that is why the term industrial relations, because lots of people started to work within factories and production engineering and various other facilities. You see that there was a bit of a unionization which tended to happen. If you were not happy, you could gather or muster support. And what would then in that case happen is that you would primarily be looking at, taking help of others and essentially looking at, maybe starting a rebellion or maybe starting some sort of a protest. So relations, in order to manage the relationship between management and workers within the particular company or industry or factory, the rise of industrial relations as a concept, as a field came up. And this, when it came up, essentially meant that at any given point in time, the relationship between employer and employee was of main importance because it contributed to collective working and employer getting the objectives fulfilled, employee at the end of the month getting paid for the work which was being done. And this was done in joint participation. And there were some boundaries defined in terms of discipline, how to manage the disputes, how to look at unionization, how to look at collective bargaining, and then what was the role of participation of management in the resolution of grievances, issues, problems was discussed. And that part or that era in which this particular topic became important was the 1940s to 60s, and it was industrial relation. Then we look at human resources development. At some stage, development became important. When I say human resources development, what do you mean by that? That in order to get employees to work, within any particular condition, factory, location, bit of work, what the companies had to do was they had to develop their employees. That means they had to train their employees to be able to work within, say, with a machine, with an equipment. Now, example, if the company deployed, or in the 1970s and 80s, we saw a lot of airline companies coming up. Now, pilot training had to be done. So one is you could basically hire pilots, which were essentially trained and had their pilot license already. But the other way would have been the company also created a scheme wherein they started to take on trainee pilots. These trainee pilots slowly and gradually went into training, and training part of it was becoming important because the company was trying to develop its own resources to be able to train them to do a particular job quite well. And here, when I talk about development, then we also talk about performance management, career development, and succession planning. So when people were working in a factory or in a location or in a particular job for a couple of years, they felt that they are not moving on, or they are not having a change in their job or in terms of their pay scale or their responsibility. Then in those cases, development side of things became important. And what companies and employers started to focus on was that they started to focus on employees to retain them in the organization. They started to focus on development part of it, and that was related to career development, succession planning. That means if the CEO is to leave, or if somebody is to abruptly leave the organization, then what will the organization do? So they started to do planning to prepare people to be able to take that role, have a shadow role, or have somebody like a COO working within the organization very closely with the chief executive. Assuming if somebody is to leave or the competition poaches the chief executive, then we have somebody who can step into the shoes and then carry on the functions independently. Now, in the 1990s and 2000, we see the role becoming strategic. So when we talk about the word strategic HRM, as I mentioned to you, we basically looked at human resources side of things being developed into frameworks, that being developed into things which could be looked at from a long-term perspective. These were then goal driven. The outcomes, the planning which was done was then made what is called goal driven. And that would mean that if companies, as an example, why it was strategic, if you see, say in Australia where you are, sometimes you see that Qantas, is the airline which basically looks at, flying. It's a national carrier for Australia. So in some cases, when you look at how the people, when they fly and when they go to different locations, you would generally see that staff has to stay overnight or air hostesses have to stay overnight. And in those cases, what tends to happen is that the human resources side of department has to ensure that they have enough planning in place to be able to have the aircraft come back. So it flies from Sydney to Perth on one day, but in the morning, in the afternoon, you want that flight to come back to Sydney. So here, what will happen is the staff which has flown and the pilots which have flown will take a break, stay down in Perth, but a new team will actually fly the aircraft and bring it back to Sydney. So here, workforce planning was required. Now, if I look at Qantas expanding and having operations in different countries, like in the UK, in the Middle East, in Singapore, or major hubs, then in those cases, they would need to look at diversity. They will hire local talent. And when we look at hiring local people, local talent, they would need to manage diversity. People from different background, culture, beliefs, values will come in. And that is where the role of HR became strategic. Now, if we look at 2010 and beyond, what we see is that a lot of technology has come into, the field of, in the organization because of software, artificial intelligence, cloud computing. You have computing power improving. So here, the focus has predominantly been on digital HRM. That means using technology to be able to make the function more effective, more productive, more efficient, but at the same time also using technological advantages or advances in technology to be able to do and do more analysis in terms of data. Because when we see the incoming of the internet in the 1990s, 1995, when Tim Berners-Lee introduced internet, you generally see that in the 2000s, when internet started to become available and people could have access to it, it also started to create a lot of data. And we look at the big 4 types of data that we get with the use of internet and internet technologies. So a lot of data started to be captured, whether it's on social media, on websites, or on digital forms and things like that. At some stage, the companies then had the data to be able to do more analysis. One of the things that you would normally see is a customer feedback survey served, and a customer survey allows the customers to rate the services of a particular airline. And what they want to then do is capture that data, convert that data into electronic format so that they can do further analysis on it to say how many customers out of 100 responded that the airline was on time, or, great staff in the airline, or food was great. And this is where they need to look at data mining right now to be able to further improve the experience for its customers, and then build on advantages which it would offer over some of the other airlines. And that is what we see in the present era after 2010, and that is focus on digital HRM. So in general, if you have to explain how human resources management is evolved, this is the timeline that you could use or figure it out in such a way that you talk about the pre-World War II era, you talk about the 90s, 70s and 80s era, you talk about the 1990s and the 2000 era, and then 2010 and beyond, where we generally see HR becoming a strategic function, leveraging technology, and that allowing you to make use of data and analytics to be able to inform for making better decisions. Is that okay? Any questions on this so
Yes.
far?
Oh, no. All
Okay.
good.
Now, the second part of the assessment criteria talks about explain the purpose of HRM. Now, we looked at what is HRM. Now we look at purpose of HRM. Now, what is the purpose of HRM? The purpose of HRM is very clear. Purpose of HRM is that we need to be able to manage and develop human resources within the organization. Its aim is to ensure the functioning of this side of the function. When you have done the recruitment selection and you're managing everything, this side of the function is something that we need to be able to manage when we look at the purpose of HR in the organization. So in general, when we talk about the purpose, we look at recruitment, selection, we look at training, development, we look at rewards and benefits, talent management, succession planning. These all are functions of what we called, the role and purpose of HRM within an organization. So if we were to talk about things like, the role of HRM would be very, very clear that we need to look at understanding how HR essentially, helps the organization improve its performance, improve its productivity, improve the efficiency, maybe retain employees within the organization. Sometimes you see there is a mass exodus which can happen if the salaries have not been revised and if the perks have not been kept up to date with what is happening in the market. You will generally see employees start resigning. If one resigns, the other resigns, and this turns into a bit of an exodus. So if the company does not realize, that means the HR department does not realize that this is going to happen, and if they have not revised the policies, then the problem is they have not been managing their side of things quite well. So here, the role and purpose of HRM would be to look into planning, organizing, directing, and controlling. These are the 4 basic functions that I would suggest you would be looking at when you say what is the purpose of HRM. So purpose of HRM in a nutshell, if I put it this way, would be this 4 functions, which is looking at managing, starting with planning, organizing, directing, and controlling. Now, this is the major purpose of HRM within any organization. And we can take an example and explain all this in terms of planning. Just a simple example, if the company's new financial year starts in January and they're looking at increasing their turnover, which is what the objective set by the leadership and the management is, then HR would need to look at if 200 people were contributing to $1 billion in turnover. If the goal this year is to double the turnover to 2 billion, how many people will be required to work, or how many additional people will be required in customer services, sales, administration, operations to be able to help a company meet that objective? That would be the process of planning. That means recruitment, selection, in which places, which countries, which branch offices, which locations they will need to hire, how much will they spend on hiring costs. That would all be planning. After the hiring has happened, then it will be organizing, sending employees into training, development, making sure they understand the functions, then directing them, which is job description in short. And then finally, also doing the process of appraisals to see if they are actually meeting the requirement. Some employees hired, given contracts, might not even complete the contracts because they have not met the criteria, and they might be just laid off after the probation period or the trial period, and they are not meeting those standards. So that is where they would be looking at controlling side of things. So here, if I look at the role of HRM or the purpose of HRM, we are very clear. The purpose of HRM is to, do planning, organizing, directing, and controlling things. And that is the central reason why HR objective or HR function will be present within the organization. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
None.
Okay. Now, we could put a lot of things into the purpose depending on the context that we are sometimes talking about. So this one slide, which I normally have, explains the purpose of HRM from an at the organization level. Okay, if you holistically, you have to see where all HR does main functions. So I've covered training, leadership, management, increasing business value, strategic objectives, hiring employees. All that would be just, giving you a depiction of what the role of or the purpose of HRM is. Now, the last assessment criteria is today's learning outcome focuses on explain the objectives of HRM. So what are the objectives of, human resources management? If we are to say that this, generically, if we have to cover, there could be many different things that we could talk about, but we will have to again put it in a context. What could be the objectives of HRM? Objectives of HRM could be, it will help in accomplishing organizational goals. That means increase the sales target or customer experience, or increase the number of customers in the company, help acquire more customers, increase or better the customer experience. It could create a better working culture within the organization. It could also train its employees and staff very well so that they are able to provide the best services to the customers, and that way reputation of the company or the prestige of the company would be built. They could also create a program in the company which will allow the employees to be motivated. That means nobody wants to leave the organization. They are loyal to it. They're happy in their role. They are well looked after. They feel that they are paid well in terms of compensation, their benefits. And then they have the ability to be able to make decisions within the organization at the relevant level. So if I'm a sales manager, I have the ability to be able to make a decision in terms of how much can I spend, what is my budget, what can I discount to the customer in order to close the sale, but still have the ability where the organization makes the profit. So all these kind of things, even in decision making, sometimes you would see would be important from an employee perspective. So here the objectives of the organization would be looking after recruitment and selection, areas which involve training and development, managing the performance of the employees, looking at compensation and benefits, looking at ensuring there are cordial relations between the management and the employees, looking at maintaining talent. People should stay within the organization instead of leaving, and they should be happy. That means HR should be proactively looking at doing career planning. If I've been a sales performer and ace performer for the last 10 years, there should have been a planning in place to allow me to become a general manager over a point in time. Or if you were an employee in the organization which was excellent in customer service, then there should be a plan in place to make you a chief learning officer or a chief customer experience officer over a point in time. As you rack up experience, you don't leave, you are getting raise or a rise in your salary. You are also getting increased responsibilities because you're performing well. And then at some stage, you're also being given other responsibility, which is managerial responsibility to be able to manage employees. And they all would be seen as managing talent by giving you opportunities to grow your role and also stay within the company. And that would be useful for you from a point of view of, being a perfect or an HR role in which you are able to maintain and, do everything. So in this case, this would be the central purpose or objective of human resources management. Is that okay? Any questions on today's session?
Yeah, all is good. No questions.
Right. Okay. So what we will do is we will, finish today's session, and then for tomorrow, what I would want to